Welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Forensic Psychology. We're really privileged today to have Dr. Kieran O'Keefe, who's an associate professor and associate head of school at Bucks New University, where he's developed a really fascinating forensic psychology master's degree. But he's also known, with hence his background, for his work in paranormal psychology. So we're fascinated to hear about both. So you're really welcome, Kieran, and it's lovely to talk to you. And we're just wondering if you could tell us a bit about how you got into this diverse career of yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. And it's not a simple question in terms of how I got involved in this diverse area. I do wear two hats, forensic psychology and kind of specializing more in investigative psychology, but also parapsychology, which is, like you said, is about my background. You can see here the spooky stuff. And I guess it started with an undergraduate degree. I mean, it might have started prior to that with being fascinated by ghosts, but also fascinated by crime, fascinated by both of those things. But then it was the psychology degree that cemented both of those interests, because I was able to study both as part of that degree. And then afterwards, after the degree, and actually as part of it, I was doing mental health nursing. So I was a healthcare assistant in a number of hospitals in the UK over the summer periods whilst I was doing my undergraduate degree. And then when I graduated, went into that full time, worked in Lewisham General Hospital, Hither Green Hospital, Wickham General Hospital as well. And there was some association there, but it was kind of seeing, a lot of what I'd learned in psychology firsthand in terms of dealing with often complex mental health needs in that sort of setting. And there were a few tangents on my path into forensic psychology, but ultimately I ended up doing a master's in investigative psychology at Liverpool University, where I was supervised by, Professor Lawrence Allison. Did a lot of work with him whilst I was doing my master's. And after the master's, I ended up staying on for a couple of government-funded projects. One of them was looking at a way of fast-tracking repeat young offenders through the criminal justice system. The other project was working on, again, looking at young offenders, but looking at ways of reducing offending and trying to deal with getting them back to work. So in situations where they weren't in school, or they were kind of 16, 17, 18, but they were definitely on a path to more offending, it was trying to get them working or in an apprenticeship or something like that, again within the Merseyside area where there was a real issue with that. And I was quite fortunate during that to have Shad Maruna, who was part of the research team, and got to know Shad very well, who's an amazing criminologist and has done some sterling work in terms of implementing Good Lives model and various things like that. So that was my introduction to forensic psychology, my master's, and then those projects afterwards. And I then went and did a PhD, which was fundamentally around parapsychology, but there were some links, which we can talk about later, with forensic psychology. And then my first academic post was at Liverpool Hope University, doing various aspects of psychology, but I got involved in a project called Impact, which was Innovation Means Prisons and Communities Together. And I was involved in risk assessing young offenders at the point a few months before their release. And it was, and then went off around the world to various institutions. So that was Liverpool Hope. I then ended up in Paris at university there doing Psychologie Légale, which is the French translation effectively of forensic psychology. I then moved to Université de Toulouse because my boss at Paris moved down there and he brought us down with him, which was lovely. Again, doing Psychologie Légale. And from there, then came back to the UK and via Derby and then briefly Oxford, then ended up at Bucks New University.
Wow, real world tour.
Wow, that is really cool. Now that you have mentioned the word parapsychology, could we ask what it is? What does it mean?
Yes, so a very basic definition is the scientific study of the paranormal. But of course, the word paranormal can mean so many different things. And parapsychology is specifically the study of three things: ESP, or extrasensory perception, PK, psychokinesis, and then what we call survival. So ESP is an umbrella term for telepathy, which is mind-to-mind communication, precognition, which is predicting the future, and clairvoyance, which is the ability to see but without your eyes. So effectively, if you put a drawing and put it in an envelope and asked me to work out what that drawing was, I might use clairvoyance to see that drawing but without my eyes. The issue is, of course, if I'm accurate, is it because of clairvoyance, or is it because I got the drawing from your mind, which would be telepathy, or is it because I had a dream a few nights ago that you were going to ask me about a drawing in an envelope, and when you did ask me, I suddenly remembered the dream, and hey presto, I got it right. And that's why we use the term ESP, because it's an umbrella term, because sometimes it can be difficult to distinguish people's experiences in terms of what they are. PK, or psychokinesis, is the ability to move objects with your mind. And the classic example that most people know is Uri Geller and spoon bending. That's moving things with your mind, or the claim of moving things with your mind. The last area of study is survival, and that is survival after death. So the evidence for it, not proof, but the evidence for it are things like hauntings, poltergeist, but also mediumship. And mediumship is the claim that people are able to communicate with the dead. And that's really my area of specialty, that third area, all of the hauntings, poltergeist, and mediumship area, which was kind of my focus. The mediumship stuff was my focus for my PhD. So that's parapsychology.
Fascinating. And how do you, I guess some of the problems we have in psychology is making it accessible to general public, but also scientific. So how do you sort of ensure it's kept as a scientific discipline?
It's a very good question. And actually, I had a conversation earlier today with a researcher that was asking me about the impact parapsychology has had on the world. And I said, well, that's a huge question, but let's reduce that to a smaller question, which is, what impact has parapsychology had on science? And I think that starts to answer your question, Jerry, because parapsychology was the first scientific discipline that actually involved the double-blind method that we know and love today. There's a lot of criticism very, very early on in parapsychology in the 1920s, and even kind of some of the precursors to it before that, about experimenter bias, and the role of the experimenter and how we can severely, quite detrimentally influence the outcome of a study simply by us knowing what our hypothesis is. So remove the experimenter and create a double-blind study was very much the role of what parapsychologists were doing incredibly early on in the field. And that's one way of keeping it obviously scientific, but also the key thing is, even despite my theatrical background, parapsychology is a science. So parapsychologists will approach the study of phenomena, but 95% of the work is laboratory based, and it is experimental work. It is about the standard sort of practice that we would have in any forensic psychology research, about looking at variables, looking at confounding variables, looking at a very tight and appropriate design, all of those things. And that's why you find the majority of parapsychologists have actually come into the field from psychology. So they bring their psychology training, especially in terms of that empirical approach, into parapsychology. So it is kept as very scientific, and you will find some parapsychologists are actually approaching it, similar to me, looking at alternative explanations and testing those in the lab. other scientists will be parapsychologists will be saying, we want to look for evidence of this sort of stuff. So whilst people will spontaneously claim to have a telepathic experience or ghostly experience, can we find evidence of that in the lab? Which means then we are controlling all of the confounding variables. And if we are successful, then there's only one possible explanation.
I have so many questions. I can't formulate one in my head. How did your interest in paranormal psychology develop? Where did that start?
Well, that started as a boy, to be honest. I was, as a very young age, reading M.R. James, H.P. Lovecraft, Stephen King, James Herbert, fascinated by the fiction side. So paranormal and horror, even to a young age where my parents were genuinely concerned about my reading material and thought I was far too young to be reading this horrific stuff. So I was fascinated by it. And then as a young teenager, the show Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World was on television, and I was an avid watcher of that. And it was right around that time that the film Ghostbusters came out. And being genuinely honest, it was Arthur C. Clarke's, it was all of those books that really got me interested in parapsychology. But I never for once, even though I dreamed of it, I never for once thought that I could make a career out of it. And like I said, it was only really when I went and studied my undergraduate psychology degree and had a little bit more of an awareness of parapsychology. I even spent many weekends at the Institute of Parapsychology, where parapsychology first started. I should say that I did my undergraduate degree in the States, just outside of Washington, DC. So I had the luxury of being able to visit the Institute of Parapsychology most weekends. And so that really cemented my interest in it. But I was always told by parapsychologists, you cannot make a career out of this. You always need to have your specialism in, your training in psychology, and you use that to, get further qualifications, masters, PhD, to go the academic route and end up in a research institute or end up in a university, and then, and only then, can you then start to maybe specialize a little bit in parapsychology. And it's partly because of the way it's viewed, but also there is a distinct lack of funding for research in this area. And so, so that's really explains my route, that I had a double interest in crime and criminal behavior, but also parapsychology, but then pursued, the kind of career route of looking very much into forensic and investigative psychology as that being where my bread and butter is. And then if I can do a little bit of parapsychology, then I will.
What about my final question in my head, if you are at the pub and you tell people you're a parapsychologist, what are the most common questions that people then ask you, or assumptions they make?
Yeah, the very first question is, can you read my mind? That's always.
That's for all psychologists. So.
Yes, true. That's
the assumption of all psychologists.
Absolutely, but say more so with a parapsychologist. But the first question tends to be that, can you read your mind? Can you read my mind? If it's not that, or the follow-up question will always be, let me tell you. And it will be, let me tell you about an experience I've had, or let me tell you about an experience my mum had, or my boyfriend had. There's always that follow-up. And I think there's been a lovely cultural shift in that response that I've seen in the last 20 years, where 20 years ago, I didn't necessarily have that response. The response was very much, oh, what is that? What is parapsychology? And they explain, and they go, oh, that's interesting. Oh, well, what do you think? Is there such a thing? And there'll be a different sort of conversation. Within about the last 5-10 years, that cultural shift has now moved to a more open, it's a disclosure. People are quite happy to talk about their experiences with somebody like myself. And I think that's a lovely shift that's happened. It creates for amazing conversations too.
Oh, wow, that's really cool.
So why do you think that is? Is it people feel they're not going to be laughed at, or that they feel they're more open to the experiences? Why do you think that's changed?
I think part of it is down to the proliferation of the subject on the internet, and also in the world's media. So now, and within the last 5 or so years, we have never seen so much paranormal media on all streaming services, social media, YouTube, you name it. It is just everywhere. And I think because of that, it creates an acceptance of it. And it creates an acceptance of it to the extent where people can talk about it quite freely, knowing that, you know, it's been watched by thousands, if not millions, by thousands of people. And therefore, if it is out there, that it's not so much of a hidden topic, you know, to talk about it. And the way to kind of illustrate how that works is, I was in France back in 2006, 2007, and there was nothing about the paranormal on television at all. Absolutely nothing. But also France had an interesting history in terms of the paranormal. They had a religion called Spiritism, which is related to spiritualism, but it's specifically Spiritism. But then also there was a weird political association between anything to do with the paranormal was seen as the occult, and it had negative connotations. Now, 2006, 2007, I would tell people that this is what I'm studying, or one of my areas of study. And I moved into a house, and the owners of the house that I bought the house off, I met them 3 or 4 times before I bought the house. We became very good friends and had dinner with them maybe 5 or 6 times after I bought the house. And so it's only on about that 6th time afterwards that they then said, let me tell you about an experience that we've had. And there was a very different response in that culture, because it was seen as a hidden thing, seen as something you don't necessarily talk about. And I think that equates a little bit with how people's experiences might have been viewed 20 or 30 years ago, or a lot longer in England and the UK, but that has changed because of this proliferation.
You said at the beginning that you have 2 hats, so your
Yes.
parapsychology hat and your forensic psychology hat. Can you ever wear 2 hats at the same time? Like, are forensic psychology and parapsychology linked?
Yes, 100%. And whilst I was very cognizant of that when I did my undergraduate degree, because there were various things that we were studying within kind of, you know, the more forensic focused modules that I saw could be applied to people's experiences. So let me give you a prime example. The cognitive interview example within a policing context is a mainstay of forensic psychology. We teach it to, you know, all our undergraduates. We're aware of the benefit of it and the enhanced version as well. Within parapsychology, when people have haunting experiences, the approach that is taken is horrific. It's just terrible. There is no real sense of how do you interview somebody that has witnessed a ghostly phenomenon. And so there's a perfect example of being able to wear 2 hats, where I can speak to ghost hunters and speak to individuals that actually interact with members of the public that have these haunting experiences, and say, you're asking about a parapsychological phenomena, but actually the way you're doing it is wrong. Let me tell you about the research in forensic psychology that shows that there's a particular way of conducting witness interviews that means you can get a lot more information and potentially a lot more accurate information. So that would be a perfect example of being able to wear 2 hats. Another example actually happened in my master's, which was in chatting with Lawrence Allison, my supervisor. He was aware of my interest in parapsychology, and I floated the idea of my master's thesis being on psychic detectives, individuals that claimed that they could assist with criminal investigations using an alleged psychic ability. And I said, look, there's a proliferation of this in North America. We're seeing some high-profile incidents of it in the UK. I would love to test this. And so I set up an experiment where I was able to get hold of objects from crime scenes. I had a police interview room and a senior police officer sit down with a number of different psychics, all individually, and present them with crime scene objects. The senior police officer would not be aware of the crime, but just say, look, I've been handed these. Is there anything you can tell us about the crime? So that was kind of the empirical project. I had a comparison group as well, which is just a group of students, non-forensic students, to see if any of the information came out was accurate. And then the information that was provided was rated in terms of accuracy against the key points of the cases by independent judges. So that's the empirical work. And you can see very clearly how that can be two hats, but also there was another extrapolation of that in terms of two hats, another impact of it, which was in examining the language that psychic detectives were using, specifically where they are providing information to criminal investigations about missing person cases or about murder cases. This was back in the 1980s, and I could see that the language that was being used was very similar to the language that was being used by some of the psychological profilers at the time. And let's bear in mind, I was doing a master's in investigative psychology, but the lead of that was Professor David Cantor, who himself was a profiler. So effectively, I was quite literally, pointing the negative finger directly at the course leader as well by saying, look, some of the language that I'm seeing here, the psychics are using, are very similar to the sort of vague and ambiguous language that I'm seeing in accounts given by psychological profilers. It's also looking at how such reports were delivered to the police, that the vagueness and ambiguity about some of the suppositions made, things like, here's a murder case, the offender's going to be between 30 and 40 years old, white male, these sorts of standard sorts of responses were seen as vague and ambiguous. So here I come barreling in with my parapsychology hat and going, you need to be careful because you sound like a psychic. And it was a little bit of a wake-up call, and you could almost sense a shift change around that time in terms of how profiling accounts were delivered. And what we see now, although we don't of course call them profilers at all, BIAs, behavioural investigative advisors, I think they're called, but the reports that are given to police in such circumstances, they will have actual numbers, statistics, evidence, everything provided with it. So it's no longer vague and ambiguous. It's no longer apparently intuitive or based on experience. It is very hard evidence. So saying in similar sort of cases where you have a murder with these characteristics, in that sort of situation, given the geography as well, 80% of those that have committed have these sorts of characteristics. And also with that caveat, by saying this, of course, there are 20% that don't have those characteristics. So it's kind of giving a bit more detail.
And could you tell us a bit about the terms that we have heard you use, group stalking and satellite terrorism? Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so I published a study last year, and ultimately we're looking at something called haunted people syndrome. But effectively the study came out of reading something called the Dr. John Hall story. There is this claim from Dr. John Hall and others that follow his work that there is this thing called, or that they experience what we call surveillance and stalking. So the term is either satellite terrorism or group stalking or gang stalking. And the premise of it is that people feel that they are stalked and surveyed by organizations. And that can be simple things like Men in Black or FBI or CIA or SIS, intelligence services, things like that. But then that delves a little bit more into conspiracy theory and conspiratorial thinking. Actually, it's wider than just the intelligence community. It's people that feel that they are being surveyed and stalked by everybody. So it still has very much a paranoid feel about it, but they feel as though that the electricity companies, the gas companies, the local council, just everybody is in some way surveying them. I was reading it, and you could tell that some of the characteristics were characteristics of people's haunting type experiences. So they would report a sense of presence, that they would be in a particular room or particular location, and they'd feel like somebody was there watching them. And the kind of the description almost matched sorts of accounts that you hear in haunting type experiences. Things like, you know, an object would go missing. They would report about their key, putting their keys down. And then when they went back an hour later, their keys were no longer there. You know, and that's quite a normal phenomenon that I think we all experience at some point anyway, and it can be due to any number of different factors. But it was you know, it's that sort of thing that they were reporting that we thought, well, that's the sort of thing that you hear in poltergeist type cases, or sometimes haunting type cases, group stalking accounts, and compared them to the narrative structure of some haunting experience accounts and poltergeist experience accounts that we had, and effectively coming up with what we called haunted people syndrome. And there's multiple authors involved in this research, and we went back and forth about that word syndrome because I'm still not 100% happy about it. I think it's too emotive. I think it's quite negatively laden. You know, as soon as you hear that word, it does imply, you know, something negative, and it implies a diagnosis. And
medical model, isn't it?
Yeah, it's that kind of medical model thing. And we went back and forth, but you know, we went through various versions of the paper, and in the paper that we published in Mental Health, Religion and Culture, we make it very, very clear that that's not what we're doing. It's not a medical model, but it's trying to emphasize the fact that there appears to be these experiences that people have, whether it's group stalking, whether it's a haunting experience. Also, we found similar with alien abduction type experiences, people you know, in different cultures reporting other odd experiences, the presence of a ghost, the presence of ethereal beings. It doesn't just have to be ghost, it can be kind of religious type experiences. But it feels as though there's a similar sort of narrative structure, the structure to it, but also in terms of the specific points that people are making about some of this phenomena that they experience. You know, there are subjective and objective anomalies that they experience. A subjective anomaly would be something like, I feel a sense of presence. We can't really necessarily measure that. An objective anomaly would be where they report something like an object moving or an object disappearing. It's something material that you can latch onto. But it seems as though there's some sort of consistent narrative across all of these odd experiences. And that's effectively what we were looking at, and effectively what we found in our analysis.
That's really interesting. I'd love to read that paper.
I was thinking about how we support victims. So people that have been victims of stalking, when someone, and it has been proven that they have been there and been stalked, they might find an element of safety, being that perpetrator of the crimes then locked away in prison and they're safe. How do you support somebody who believes that they've been stalked, or there's been a presence somewhere? How do you validate that experience and support them?
Really, it's really difficult, isn't it? And you used a key word there. How do you validate that experience? You know, in a group stalking example, you know, there's no doubt that there is an overlap with conspiratorial thinking and kind of paranoid thinking, the fact that all of these organizations are responsible in surveying you in some way. But also it's very difficult, isn't it? Because in today's culture, we're very conscious of the fact that people do feel surveyed.
Mm.
We do feel as though every time we go onto the internet and we say yes to allowing cookies, that's being surveyed in a way. You know, so how do you validate the experience when part of that experience appears to be not true, somewhat fantastical, but then part of it has almost kind of a rational, logical side to it because of what's happening in today's culture, and because of some news items that we hear about in various other cultures where there is a real sense that your mobile phone is followed, for example, and you know, the activity that you do on the internet is followed. So I agree with you. I think it's a very, very difficult sort of victim to deal with, where there isn't a tangible outcome in terms of the perpetrator being locked away, because who is the perpetrator? Potentially we're dealing with individuals where the perpetrator is effectively their thinking, their interpretation of events. So the way to deal with a victim in such circumstance is through professionals, is through counselling, is through mental health specialists. But there's a researcher that we had involved in that particular case, Lorraine Sheridan, who's based in the States, who her particular interest in this is exactly what you're saying, is these individuals will fight back and be quite vitriolic and aggressive to anybody that says that these experiences are not true. So for an ethical psychologist to have that as a starting point, you would never say that. But her work is very much, how do you try and get these victims to change their thinking so that they no longer feel that they're victimized? And there are various ways that you can do that. She's exploring ways to do with CBT and various other things. And there are some interesting work in conspiracy theory, conspiratorial thinking, in terms of how you can get people change their mind. But it's not a quick process, and it's not as quick, like you say, as having that really positive, tangible outcome where the perpetrator is locked up, because it just won't happen.
And could you tell us a bit, Kieran, about the forensic psychology qualification you've developed, which is really fascinating, and one I attempted to go on there myself.
So I developed an MSc in applied forensic psychology, and I developed it because of my experience on the Masters in Investigative Psychology, but also because I was very much aware, speaking to alumni from the university who had gone into prison-based setting or other forensic-based settings at a particular level, and we're looking at how can they progress and how can they achieve chartership effectively. I wanted to give students the experience that I never had, which was, whilst I loved the masters that I did, I never went into a prison. I never worked with a senior officer from the Met Police who was able to talk about their experience in the Westminster terrorism incident. I never had an experience where I was able to go to some of the amazing charities that work with probation services and help with ex-offenders or addiction problems, or help with families of offenders, that sort of thing. So it was all of those aspects, and that's why I kind of gave it that applied thing, because I really wanted students to come away from the masters having had all of those experiences, to be able to visit prisons, but to be able to talk to chartered forensic psychologists, to be able to work with police, to be able to have, which we did recently, a forensic science experience. That is not forensic psychology, to be able to go into a crime scene and to analyze blood splatter or to analyze fingerprints. But even just a day of that makes for a fascinating student experience, an exciting student experience, where no matter what context they're in, they can always have that knowledge of, I had a day's workshop that was run by an experienced CSI investigator and forensic scientist with the Met Police, where I learned exactly what they do. So if they end up in an intelligence analysis position as a civilian with the police, they know that step that's taken with the crime scene. But even if they end up, as the majority do, within a prison setting, still is that experience they've had, and who knows, if that's of help at some point down the line. If it is, then that's a bonus. Even if it's not, it's an interesting student experience, because you go for a day, that's forensic science. Now are you clear? That's not forensic psychology. They have an arrangement with Aylesbury Crown Court where they spend the day in half a day in Aylesbury Crown Court, whether we have the actual judges, so a judge and actual lawyers, and it's a complete simulated courtroom. So having gone from a crime scene, which they do in one of our weeks, they go from the crime scene to then interviewing a suspect, to then that suspect being in the courtroom, to then, once they're given their sentence, found guilty and given their sentence, they then go into prison. They're almost following the criminal justice stages in a way, but in reality, you know. And like I said, the main motivation for that was, what would I have wanted on my master's? And so hence creating the one that I've got now.
I would have totally wanted that on my master's.
I believe you've got a book coming out next year. Would you like to
yes.
tell us a bit about your book?
Yeah, so I've got a book. It's not a forensic book, but it's a book called Ghosted. And of course, the definition of that is to do with relationships. It's not about that. It's about exploring the haunting reality of paranormal encounters. And this effectively comes from the international group of researchers that we laughingly call ourselves the Global Ghost Gang, getting together. And for the past 4 years, we have done research that we've published in peer-reviewed journals. So an example was the haunted people syndrome. There are the other example about those ghostly accounts that we've published as well, the difference between those accounts, and there are various others, but very much led by our interest in then looking at the literature and going, right, how can we further this? And so we've done that over the last 4 years or so, and I would say published about 20 or so, been very, very speedy and very productive factory line almost of work that we've done the last 4 years. But the key thing is, how do you bring that to the public? How do you bring that to the public, but also those where we would like them to know, so ghost hunters and others. And you can do that to an extent by publishing in journals where they are open access, and we've done that for some of them. For others, they don't have open access. And so what we've done is taken all of those articles and rewritten them in a more accessible way, because let's be honest, whilst I love writing for peer-reviewed journals, there's a particular way that we write, particular formal, academic, scientific way, and obviously sometimes that's not, you know, approachable for the lay public. So we've taken all of those articles and rewritten them in a more accessible way for mainstream audience, and put them all together in this particular book. And the lovely thing about the gang is that we have very different perspectives on things, and we make that very clear in our bios, that you've got some members of that gang that are almost devout believers in ghostly experiences, whereas you've got others who are skeptical, which means open-minded but questioning, and you've also got ones that I would say are verging on the cynical, although they shouldn't be as a scientist, but they are. But all of us working together with an end aim, which is to understand these experiences. And I think that's refreshing scholarly activity, to be able to do that. And you get our voices coming through in the book. And that's the great thing about it, is you get all these different perspectives. So it'll be published in the new year. We were hoping for a Halloween release, which would have been perfect. But now it's going to be released.
Or Christmas.
Christmas
Present.
Top of everyone's Amazon wish list.
I know. So now it's going to be in some dry patch in the new year, I think around January, February, published by McFarland Books. It's available for pre-order. If you go into McFarland Books, you can find it, or just type in Ghosted Haunting Reality, you can find it that way. But it is available on Amazon for pre-order, but also McFarland Books. So exciting to see how that's received.
We look forward to seeing it, and I think it's been really interesting today how you've shown how these subjects interweave with each other and are actually scientific and not as we might see in the popular TV programs, you know, and there has to be room for both, doesn't there? But
yes,
it's got a root in its science, which is important for us, obviously, to be legitimate.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, it's been an interesting discussion.
Well, it's been lovely to see you again, Kieran, and only remains for us to say, let's talk forensic psychology.